High cost of living, ain't nothing like the cost of living high.
Hello and welcome back to this final lesson in Unit 3. We're going to now talk about the problems of inflation. We know how to measure inflation. Now we're going to talk about why inflation matters in the economy. Okay, first off, what we need to realize is, and we're going to abstract a little bit from our measurement because our measurement takes a look at just the general price level. But what we want to realize is when inflation happens because money comes into the economy at specific places at specific times, and it actually doesn't cause the price of all goods to rise at the same time. It will eventually cause all goods to go up in price, but initially it's going to cause certain goods to go up in certain locations. And a good way to think about this is, again, go back in history and think about when the U.S. is actually on a gold standard. We're using gold and sometimes silver as well as our currency. Okay, how does new money come into the economy? Well, it happens in a gold rush. And of course we're talking about here the California gold rush, the 49ers, not those 49ers. But these 49ers. Right? So this is the source of inflation when the U.S. economy is on a gold standard. Starts near the gold mines, gradually spreads to the rest of the economy. New money comes in the hands of successful gold miners, and what's going to happen is there's going to be more spending on goods. There's going to be new spending on goods right around the gold mines. Okay, so the inflation will happen there first, and then only gradually, as the money flows out through the merchants and then through other industries, the inflation will gradually, over time, affect the rest of the economy. As I mentioned here, you take a look at the classic example from U.S. history with the California gold rush in the 1850s. What you saw is prices in the gold fields shot up first. San Francisco would be the main supply hub for the gold mining region out on the west coast, and you saw prices of all kinds of goods, food items, clothing, especially mining capital, mining tools, picks and shovels, would be something like 2 to 3 times what they were on the east coast. And this actually was the genesis of the clipper ship. It took long time. It took months. It took basically all summer to go overland from St. Louis or Kansas City with a wagon load of goods to California. Well, a clipper ship could do it in maybe 80 or 90 days. Okay, the clipper ships, you'll see, they were nothing but sail and a relatively small cargo, and their goal was to get these goods they could buy for very cheap on the east coast and get them to the west coast and the gold miners as fast as they possibly could. Now, of course, we're on a paper money system now. So individual citizens can't go and literally produce money like they could back in the gold standard days, but the same kind of effect will happen in that new money enters the economy at specific locations, specific points in time. Now, though, it's the government issuing all the money. It's technically the government's central bank, the Federal Reserve, which we'll talk a lot more about later on. The same phenomenon is in place. The new money is going to enter the economy in particular points in time, and it's going to cause a ripple effect of inflation. If you take a look, though, historically at the first kinds of paper money that were used in the United States, they were actually government-issued, treasury-type currency. And you saw the exact same kind of pattern as with the gold standard. The inflation is going to start in those industries where the government's spending the money on, and then eventually spreads out to the rest of the economy. Classic example here is the wartime inflation in the 1860s. Although eventually the price of all goods in general, the price index, and remember you can look back at the CPI numbers, that's basically going to double during the war years. It's going to affect certain goods before others, and oftentimes labor will be the last good affected. Okay, war materials will go up in price very fast, so things like gunpowder will rise in price very fast. Wages of an average worker, they actually are going to go down in real terms. They rise, but they don't rise as much as inflation, which means in real terms they go down. Okay. We can see here that some people are going to be worse off because of the inflation, and this we're going to get into talking about the problems. In fact, inflation is called a tax for this reason, because the government can gain purchasing power for itself by issuing new money, and the common citizens are frequently going to suffer because of this. Okay, and this brings us to our first major type of effect of inflation that we're going to look at, which is a redistribution of wealth effect. And there's two aspects to this. The first one is what I identify as the early late recipient effect. Put quite simply, inflation transfers real income or purchasing power from the late recipients of new money to the early recipients. Okay. Why? Well, quite simply, early recipients get to spend money before the prices go up. Remember, you have to spend that new money to make the prices go up. Okay. Early recipients get to spend it first. Prices then go up. People who receive the money last see the prices go up before they get their hands on the new money. And again, note here the inflation tax is at play because government in a paper money system is by definition the first recipient. Government is issuing the money. Government can spend, can acquire more goods. And if you think about how many goods are available in the economy at a given point in time, well, it's relatively fixed. Okay, the quantity of goods can't grow very fast. So if the government's getting more goods for whatever purposes, for fighting a war or what have you, that means the citizens are left with fewer goods. Okay? Inflation is a tax. It's not called a tax. It's not labeled as a tax. The government will often try to downplay its effect, but it's clearly a tax nonetheless. Okay, a second effect, which will again be a redistribution of wealth effect that we'll see with inflation, is known as the debtor-creditor effect. Debtors, of course, that's just a fancy term for people who borrow money, and creditors for people who lend money. And what we're going to see with inflation, especially when it's unexpected, okay, when people don't see it coming, is that it's going to reduce real interest rates on loans. If you're borrowing, you want to see lower interest rates, so that's going to help you as a borrower. And it's also going to reduce the real value of your principal. So we're going to see that borrowers benefit from this. They see the real value of their debt decreased. In other words, they can repay their debt, which is a fixed quantity of money, with the same quantity of money, remember, is worth much less when inflation occurs. So debtors can repay with depreciated money that's easier to get their hands on. Okay. Lenders, on the other hand, are going to lose out. They're going to see their real return on their investments reduced by the inflation, and it can even become negative. Okay. So lenders can actually see a reduction, even though they're going to get not paid nominally in more dollars. Every dollar is worth proportionately less than what they were planning on, so they're actually losing out. Go ahead and take a look at the math on this. It's something called the Fisher effect. So let's just imagine we have a loan contract, and I'm going to make this really simple. And I'll say you are the borrower, and I'll say I am the lender. You borrow $1,000 from me, $1,000 principal of the loan at 5% simple annual interest, which is due in 1 year. So at the end of 1 year, of course, you're going to pay me back my $1,000 principal plus 5% of $1,000, $50. I'll label that P. $50 interest, I'll label that I. Okay. Now, why do you pay the interest? Of course, and we'll talk about this a bit more later on when we get into some business cycle theory, but you pay the interest because you've got pressing need for the money. You might be buying a house, you might be financing a business. It's worth your while to pay the interest because you either value the consumption highly enough or you're going to get a return on your business investment. Why do I loan you the money? Well, of course, I don't need it. I don't need to use it right away, and I want to put my money to work. I want to invest it. I'm going to gain a 5% return. Okay, I don't need to use. I can wait to use my $1,000 principal for the year. Well, I'm going to get a $50 bonus, so to speak, in the terms of my interest payment. And for me, it's interest income. So you're probably familiar with this. This is how a standard loan contract works. And barring inflation or barring something bad happening to you where you can't repay the loan, everything will be hunky-dory at the end. You successfully pursue your opportunity with the $1,000. You pay me back at the end. I gain my $50 return. Okay, we're both happy. But let's look at what the effect of inflation is going to be, especially a high inflation rate that we don't anticipate. Let's say, for instance, let's be very specific about this, that we have an unexpected inflation rate for the year that this loan occurred in of 10%. Here's what's happening. from my perspective, my interest payment is increasing my quantity of money by 5%. Okay? I'm going to call that my nominal return. I have 5% more dollars at the end of the year. But inflation is reducing the value of every one of my dollars, my original dollars and my 50 new dollars, by 10%. So here's my 10% inflation rate, which is subtracting from the purchasing power of each of my dollars. Once I factor out inflation, remember that term, real, the real price, factoring out inflation, exact same thing we're going to do here with the real interest rate. And 5 minus 10 is minus 5. An inflation rate greater than your nominal interest rate leaves you with a negative real interest rate. I am the lender. Inflation wipes me out. Now, not totally, but it puts my return negative, so it's not worthwhile for me to lend you money. Okay, so the lender is unhappy. Would have been better off doing something else with my money, possibly something that kept up with inflation, like putting my money into land or gold or some other kind of commodity that keeps up with inflation. You, the borrower, on the other hand, in a sense, you're getting paid to borrow money. Now, provided you can maintain some kind of income with which to repay the loan, you're going to be happy. Okay? My real return is your real cost, and notice it's less than zero. If you're having trouble thinking about it, let me kind of put this in a slightly different terms for you. If we can think about the real rate, we can also think about the value of the principal. Okay, and in this case, I want us to think about an extreme inflation rate. So let's say you've got that $1,000 principal at the beginning of the loan term, and let's say you use that to buy some business equipment. Maybe you buy a computer, you buy some tools, you start a little business, you start earning some money. 1 year later, you've earned some profit, you can repay the loan out of that profit. If the inflation rate is extreme, and it's always helpful to think in extremes, let's say the inflation rate is 1,000%. By the way, think back to our hyperinflation episodes, which I touched on in the last lectures, and the book talks about it extensively. That's not uncommon. Okay, lots of countries have experienced inflation rates much higher than this, even in recent years. Okay, but what a 1,000 inflation rate does is reduces the real value of that $1,000 in principal down to the equivalent of $1 worth of goods if we're talking about the beginning of the borrowing period. You can repay this loan with $1 in terms of the beginning value worth of goods. Right? It's essentially free money. When you borrow and then hyperinflation hits, you're winning big. It's essentially free money. Okay, so the borrower here is very happy. Okay? You've really cashed out. You've essentially stolen, although maybe you didn't desire to steal, but you're getting an involuntary transfer of wealth from the lender. The lender, of course, is really getting shafted. The lender lost basically the entire value of the loan. And again, this is with hyperinflation. Okay, but with lower inflation, you're still going to have the same effect, just on a smaller scale. The lender loses a little bit with low inflation, the borrower gains a little bit with low inflation, but the effect is still there. Okay? So it's crucial, and especially when we get into talking about business cycles, especially when we get talking about the credit cycle, the boom bust in the economy, and fluctuations with interest rates, it is very, very important to understand this effect of inflation on real interest rates, real returns, the debtor-creditor effect. Okay. One last thing I'll mention here, what you might be wondering, what is this Fisher effect? The Fisher effect is named after economist Irving Fisher, who wrote extensively on this about 100 years ago. And Fisher says, well, look, lenders aren't stupid, right? When we talk about lenders, who are the lenders in the economy? What's the industry that specializes in making loans? This is the banking industry. Okay? People in the banking industry aren't stupid. They're going to be interested in trying to predict inflation, and they're going to use economic data, and they're going to have economists on their staffs trying to predict and trying to develop some expectations about what inflation's going to be, what inflation's going to do. And in my previous example where the inflation rate wound up being 10%, they can probably predict this on average with a fairly good degree of accuracy. So the bankers, as in the previous example, want to earn 5% return on their money. They're predicting 10% inflation. What they're going to do is simply add in the inflation rate on top of the rate of return they want to earn, and we'll call this is the inflation rate. We'll call this an inflation premium on the loan. And what interest rate are they actually going to charge in the loan document? Well, they're going to charge 15%, and we'll call this the nominal interest rate. Okay. And this phenomenon here where you'll see once inflation kicks in and people start expecting these inflation rates, and it gets added back in, and nominal interest rates go up with inflation. And that's exactly what we mean by the Fisher effect. So let me go ahead and define this here. Nominal interest rates rise with inflation. You can really see this Fisher effect at work if you look back at the inflation rate and various interest rates going back over U.S. history. So what I have is the bank prime loan rate. That's the blue line. And this is basically the interest rate that well-established businesses can borrow at. Businesses with good credit, businesses with a lot of assets, a good track record of earning profits, they can generally go into a bank and borrow short-term money, short-term funds at the prime loan rate. And businesses often will, even large businesses will go in, from time to time they prefer to borrow money rather than liquidate assets or something along those lines. So this is currently, you can see right here, it's currently at about 3%. I think it's 3.25% right now, but let's just call it 3%. Well, notice our inflation rate has been pretty low. In fact, our inflation rate goes negative in 2009. It did spike up briefly to about 4%, but now it's back, inflation rate's back about 2%. Okay, so what's our real prime interest rate right now? It's 1%. 1% real interest rate for prime bank loans. Again, these are short-term loans. These are going to be typically like a 30-day type loan. A business that just needs some cash, some temporary financing, can come in and borrow this kind of money from a bank. But notice when inflation was higher, okay, and inflation again is the red line. When inflation was high, like here it was high in 1980, we had that 14% annual inflation rate in this inflationary period of the 1970s. You can see where the inflation rate starting in right around 1970 here, the inflation rate starts to go up. This is where we get into that printing too much money mode. Inflation rate goes up and it peaks about 14%. Look what happens to these short-term interest rates. They go up and they hit 20%. Okay, short-term interest rates at 20%. Inflation's at 14. Once again, real interest rate's the difference. We have a 6% real short-term interest rate back in 1980. And let me ask you something. Do you think that's a high interest rate? You better believe it. Okay. Again, the 20%, that seems sky high, but 14% of that's an inflation premium. So what we want to focus on is that real interest rate adjusting for inflation. Well, rates are low now. That's 1%. Rates are very low because the Federal Reserve is trying to stimulate the economy. We'll talk about that later. But rates were very high back then. 6% on prime bank credit is a very high interest rate. Okay. You go back to a stable period in the 1950s and 60s, you see there was a few up and downs here, but go back and look at this pretty stable time in the economy and the rate was about as low as it is now. Okay. So it definitely has its ups and downs, but what's going to be driving it up more than anything, and let me clean this off. You'll notice what's going to be driving it up more than anything. Look at the tight fit with inflation. When inflation goes up, the prime rate goes up. When inflation comes back down, the prime rate comes back down. And these two series move in lockstep. And I could show you any interest rate series and you'll see when inflation comes down, that's the red line. The interest rate comes down, that's the blue line. Okay. So inflation rates do drive interest rates because inflation, remember, is reducing the purchasing power of your money. You've got to compensate for that. When you're trying to earn an interest return, you've got to add the inflation rate back in, and that is what this Fisher effect is all about. Okay, Fisher effect, again, is the inflation premium on interest rates. Okay, one final effect of inflation that we'll talk about is something we call money illusion. Money illusion is where people can't tell the difference between nominal prices. Remember, nominal prices are just inflation causing prices to go up in general, and real prices, which is what's the actual price when we factor out inflation. Okay, especially true for relatively low rates of inflation. People see prices move up, and they aren't necessarily sensing, that's inflation. They might think the price is actually going up, the real price is going up. Okay. Well, if people can't discern the difference between a nominal and a real price change, in other words, if people can't discern the effect of inflation, people as consumers, okay, you and I as consumers are gonna be apt to make some poor economic decisions. For example, okay, let's say you get a 5% raise. Your income, your nominal income, I should technically have said nominal income. Okay, that just means the numbers on your paycheck, but we haven't adjusted for inflation yet, so we don't know if that's a real increase. But let's say your nominal income goes up 5%. You might be pretty excited about this, especially in times like right now, coming out of recession. Incomes have been pretty stagnant. Okay, you start to see your income goes up, you're feeling really good. You're feeling wealthier. You're feeling like you have a more solid financial footing, and it's not surprisingly, are going to decide to start increasing your consumption. For instance, let's say you take out a mortgage on a larger house. Okay, just as one example amongst many. However, if inflation winds up being 5% as well, this is just like when we factor out inflation from the nominal interest rate. Same exact concept here. We've got a 5% nominal increase, but we have to subtract a 5% inflation rate because, again, inflation is reducing the purchasing power of each of your dollars. So minus 5% inflation, and we wind up with a 5 minus 5, quick, do the math, 0% real adjusted for inflation increase. Not an increase at all, 0% change. Okay. So was it a good idea to take out a mortgage on a larger house when your income didn't go up in real terms? No, bad idea. Now you've got a bigger house payment with the same real income, and now you're at higher risk of not being able to make that payment. You're at higher risk of default. You're at higher risk of foreclosure. You're at higher risk of financial embarrassment. Okay, and it's not just you. If this happens across the economy, and why can it happen? Well, it can happen because of bad monetary policy. It can happen for many reasons. But if a lot of consumers are making the same kind of mistake, what are we liable to see? Yeah, you might start to sense here, we're liable to see some economy-wide mistakes, some bad investment decisions across the economy. We're going to see things like business cycles. Okay. To make that even a little more clear, let's think about the money illusion effect for producers, for entrepreneurs who are in the business of producing goods and services. Okay. Remember, money illusion is not being able to discern a nominal price change, which is strictly driven by inflation, from a real price change, which is driven by the supply and demand of a good. Okay. And remember, this point is so crucial. New money enters the economy at specific points. It doesn't affect all prices equally, and I should add to this, or immediately. Okay. Some prices are going to rise faster than others, and this is a crucial aspect of inflation that's going to be so important when we start talking about business cycles. Okay. We might see inflation drive certain goods, certain output goods, okay, certain consumer goods, certain final goods prices up before they drive some of the factor prices, okay, up. And why? Well, we don't really have time to talk about this now, but I'll address in some detail some of the factors behind this, but I'll just tell you right now, one of the main factor prices we'll be looking at is the price of labor, and the price of labor notoriously lags. Its price doesn't tend to adjust right away. Okay? Remember our classical factors of production: land, labor, and capital. Labor prices in particular, even capital prices, are going to lag general inflation. Okay? So labor is a big component of any company's costs, and the labor costs, workers' wages, they don't rise right away when inflation starts happening. Final goods prices, consumer goods prices, can start rising right away. Okay? This, let me take us back to the idea of the inflation tax for a minute. You can see the inflation tax here. If consumer goods prices start going up right away with inflation, but the wage of labor stays stagnant, you can see that workers are losing real purchasing power. Okay, so there's the inflation tax at work. But we want to think about what's the effect on producers, what's the illusion effect, where you can't tell a nominal price change from a real price change. Well, if entrepreneurs see the price of final goods that they're selling, the goods that they're producing, go up, but they see factor prices hold constant, at least for now, what does that mean? That means higher profits. Okay, higher profits, at least for a while. And how do businesses normally respond? How do businesses normally respond to higher profits? We'll think back to our market model. Higher profits, businesses are going to march up the marginal cost curve. They're going to expand. They're going to increase the quantity supplied. Okay? Businesses might increase production in response to inflation. Okay? And increasing production, note, involves creating more capital, okay, more investment in capital, more buildings, more equipment, more machinery, more tools, and hiring more workers, the factor of production whose cost doesn't change very fast. Okay, workers look relatively a lot more affordable if their costs stay the same, but the price of the goods you can sell by hiring workers goes up. Okay. When costs eventually rise, now eventually all the prices go up. The price of labor, land, and capital will eventually correct as well. It might take years, but eventually those prices will move their way up as well. And when the costs rise, okay, the profits are no longer there. At least the higher profits are no longer there, and they actually could become negative. Okay, they at least get diminished back down to what they were. You know, let's say the profits were 5%, but with inflation, they move up to 10%. Well, when the costs rise, the profits go away. They might go back down to 5% or less. You know, they might go down to 0. They might actually go negative. Doesn't matter. Even if they actually went back to 5%, okay, what happens to this business's expansion? Creating more capital, building more buildings, for instance, putting new machines in new buildings, hiring more workers. Is that extra investment and hiring justified if the profits are diminished back down? Well, no, right? What happens? Well, the businesses are not going to scale back production, and they're going to throw these factors of production out of work. Okay, when labor's thrown out of work, we call that unemployment. When capital's thrown out of work, we call that underutilization. And these are precisely the things, when we start talking about the business cycle, these are precisely the things we'll see. Okay? Inflation. Now, this is a kind of a simplistic story. The real world will be much more complex than this, but you can see how inflation can generate a business cycle. And let me show this to you in graphical terms, just to maybe make it a little bit more clear. Okay, so I'm going to take a look at our supply and demand diagram for a business that produces, let's just be really generic here and say consumer goods. And note, the business doesn't really know its demand curve exactly. It might have a pretty good estimate, but they can't really observe this. They can only estimate it. So I'm going to draw this as a dotted line. There's demand 0, the initial demand curve. Let's pencil in a supply curve. Now they do presumably know their supply curve with a fair degree of accuracy, because remember, supply is their cost, specifically their marginal costs of production. Okay? And businesses got to know their costs. If they don't know their costs, they're not going to do very well. Okay, what happens when inflation drives up the price? Now let's label in here the initial equilibrium price of the goods they sell, price 0 and quantity 0. What happens with inflation? Well, inflation is going to drive up the price of the goods they sell up to P1, and technically it is increasing the level of the demand curve up to D1. And the business might think, well, gee, the price is up, that means demand's up. In a nominal sense, it is. Okay. But the crucial component here is what's driving demand. Is it merely more money in the economy, or is it an actual shift in consumer tastes and preferences? Well, again, the business might not know that, especially at the beginning of an inflation. They don't know that inflation is happening because nobody's really seen the inflation yet. Only a few businesses have seen a few prices rise. Okay, so what are they going to do? Just, well, as I said, they're going to expand output up to Q1, and that'll often entail increasing capital investment, building new buildings, buying new equipment, buying more trucks, so on and so forth, and hiring more labor. This is a business expansion. The economy's in a good mood, unemployment's going down, GDP growth is high. What eventually happens? Eventually inflation puts upward pressure on all prices in the economy. So eventually down the road, and it could be years, it could take years, but eventually it's going to put upward pressure on all prices, including this business's costs. And I'm going to draw a higher cost curve. Let's label that supply 1. And notice here, now the higher cost curve intersects the new demand curve right back here, and we're back to square one, right? What had been an expansion now turns back around, and it's a contraction and moving from Q1 back to Q0. What's going to happen to labor hiring? Well, now we're going to replace that with layoffs, because you don't need so many workers at a lower production capacity, and some capital might even be idled. Okay, so you're going to have underutilization of capital. Okay. In fact, if you were in the middle of your expansion process, what you might see is some construction projects don't get completed. You'll have a lot of trucks just sitting around. Okay, these are the hallmarks of a recession: layoffs, unemployment of labor, underutilization of capital. A boom in production followed by a bust in production when this happens throughout the economy, because many entrepreneurs, many businesses saw an increase in prices which they mistook for actual demand. It was mere inflation. Okay, and again, this is a pretty simplistic story, but you can see here the genesis of an inflation induced business cycle. We can call it an inflationary boom bust cycle in the economy. Okay. And when we actually look at business cycle theory, we'll look at several different kinds of business cycle theory. There's this style of business cycle theory that will be very similar. It'll be quite a bit more complex than this, but it'll be very similar. So kind of keep this in mind. Going into business cycle theory, we can see that inflation will potentially be a causal factor. Inflation might not be a causal factor, but inflation might be an important result, because we're going to talk about the role of money in the business cycle, the role of spending. Okay, so it will really it'll really benefit you to understand the role of inflation when we're talking about the business cycle.